bar stool she took off her ring.
I'm curious how important you think it is for a writer to deal with those issues, however they choose to, right? Whether it's, you know, a 9/11 book that's clearly a 9/11 book, or a book that maybe is set during that time period and doesn't once mention, you know, planes going into a building. Or whatever.
I mean, I think that's been a big question for fiction as time has gone on, is in a post 9/11 world, like, was that the thing that shaped everything, and that somehow you like have to like integrate it in a way, or if the book at all takes place during or after or pre that time period in a close way, that it needs to be dealing with that. Yeah, so I think that's a big question. But I never think anybody has any responsibility to do anything in their own work. I think they have a responsibility to try to produce something authentic to themselves, and if you can do that, then you've probably accomplished something, you know? I actually feel like I really like the Russian formalist idea of like a work should just stand on its own. The author should have no like role, and then the reader should certainly never like read through the lens of like the author or the author's lives or the time period the author lived in, which is kind of antithetical to everything we teach kids in college, because it's all about like, oh, hey, English major, like you can't write an essay about James Baldwin's Stranger in the Village, like without knowing that, like, you know, Brown versus the Board of Education was passed in 1954 and this essay was written directly after that. Like it wouldn't make sense to write an essay, a comparative essay about it without talking about that. But I feel like as a writer, I hope readers come to texts like just like as if they were in like a blank void, kind of, because I feel like the text should be able to stand up and do its own thing, and I would never want anyone to have to look through the lens of like who was she or what was her life or what was the time period to ever understand anything.
Do you think that's possible anymore? Like in this age that we live in, where we have to work hard to keep ourselves private, or to like stay away from, I think, that urge and sometimes the demand to be all knowable or ever present, or have your picture on your book.
Right, totally. Yeah. I mean, it makes me think about, you know, that Jenny Livingston documentary, Paris is Burning? Have you seen that?
I haven't seen it.
It's an amazing documentary. I saw it at Bard, where I was teaching last summer, and I've been teaching it a bunch this semester. It was made by this woman, Jenny Livingston, a white queer woman who grew up, you know, I don't know, I want to say New York, but I'm not sure. And Judith Butler wrote this really interesting critique of Jenny Livingston making this movie, because it's about drag clubs in Harlem in the late 80s, and this was sort of in that era when voguing was becoming popular. So, I mean, I think it's this brilliant documentary. She goes into all of the drag clubs and follows all of the different families of people that are dancing there, and also does like one-on-one interviews, and there's so much in there. I mean, the thing is just like you can unpack it for days in terms of looking at like the difference between the way that people are impersonating not only gender but also like race and class. I mean, because a lot of the like contests or whatever for drag, like one of them is called like Town and Leisure, and it's basically like you need to look like rich white people riding horses, you know, or like on your yacht, but there's also one where it's like we're gonna look like military people, and then there's one where it's like you just play like what would it mean to look like straight, basically, like to read as straight on the street. And I think the documentary is so fascinating. But then when I read the Judith Butler critique of it, she was saying, to your question, like, it's impossible for the person who created the artwork to disappear. And her whole critique was like, here is Jenny Livingston as like a cisgendered queer white woman coming in and filming like, you know, non-cisgendered black, sometimes queer, often trans men, right? And she is still using some sort of an outsider lens, as, you know, in the way that she's doing it. And in that way, Butler's whole critique is that somehow Jenny Livingston's movie actually just functions through this like really heteronormative lens, because it's constantly about relating the movie back to like white female sexuality. I mean, because this is what a lot of the drag performances were trying to appropriate, which was just a really bizarre argument, and not one that I agreed with at all. But it did make me think like, so Livingston's never directly in the frames, you know, you're saying can an artist or an author like be totally away, other than their work. And she kind of does what you're doing now, where like occasionally you hear her in certain shots say something to one of the people, but for the majority of the movie, she's just like behind the camera, she's the eyes behind it. But that whole question was like, okay, is she then, and the consciousness of her through her lens, like ever present, kind of. I thought that was interesting. And I guess in terms of fiction, I feel like, yeah, you're right, it's hard. And then social media our age, because especially if you have like a small press book like this, I just wrote a piece for Poets and Writers about doing my own PR, which was like what I spent my entire summer doing. And I actually think nowadays, like I have friends that have books that came out with major publishers, hardcover, where they got like a really great advance and they have a publicist, and they, to be honest, they're the ones like having crises about like, oh my God, like nothing happened. We didn't get an interview. We didn't get one review. Like, and I've had several of them coming to me being like, okay, how do you do it? And I'm like, I think the thing about PR is like, unfortunately, it is about being a genuine person and thinking about like, okay, these are just the people I've met in New York over 10 years, like who might want to read this book or talk about this book or not. And that like made me feel better about it actually, because I felt like it was a really natural process. Like I felt like I was actually able to just kind of go to friends and say like, here, this is his book, I've been working on it for 7 years, and like living in a 7 foot wide studio with another human while I wrote the first draft of it. And I think a lot of people were like happy that it was just finally done, and were really generous with their time. But yeah, I do think that it would have been impossible for me to have made the decision to not like try to take a public face with it or whatever, or have a Twitter account or a Facebook, because if I didn't, there would literally be the book would have no presence whatsoever.
What we're really talking about is identity, right? Like your own identity, but also the identity that you create for the characters, or the identity of the people who either, when you watch something, you want to believe they're real, or you know that they are real, or you know that they're not real.
Yeah.
And that's really complicated. It's a complicated relationship between also like how we deal with each other, and how I know what your identity is, or you know what my identity is.
Yeah.
And then
Totally.
you were talking about translation earlier, but the translation of that onto the page, so not from like from one kind of a language of how we talk about identity and show identity publicly, and then also how we think about it and show it privately.
And I think the best work is the work that feels the most private, right? That where you, like when you write it, you allow yourself to the scrim of thinking like, no one's ever going to read this. I'm writing it for myself. Like, I think that's the thing that produces the best work, that produces that kind of authority. Like Dan Williams used to say, like, news, voice, and authority. Like news is the smallest part of fiction. It's like at the top, it's important. It's like pivotal.
Like what happens?
What happens, the who, what, when, where, why. And like voice supporting that, and then like authority being the bigger thing that supports that. And I think authority is basically saying like, the more private you can make a piece feel, whether it's through language or the way that you like let the reader inhabit the writer's mind on the page, or the character's problems, or the sense of place, or even just like the grammar or the syntax or the sense of the invented world, like that's what makes the piece publicly work in a lot of ways, is that it's somehow allowed people to like feel that sense of privacy, you know.
I think that's something I talked about with Adam when I interviewed him, when he's talking about like when you're reading, you are sort of physically covering yourself, or you're cutting yourself, you're using the book to sort of give space between you and the world, and so you enter, if you're in public, a sort of a private space, which is
utterly
interesting.
Yeah, I mean, my sister is a lawyer who lives in London, and she reads a ton, and I'm always just remarking, because she also works a ton, and she's like more up on contemporary literature than I am right now. She's like, did you read Commonwealth? Have you read it? I'm like, oh my God, slow down. But she uses it in that way. Like her job is so stressful, and it's so not that she said, when I read, I feel like I escape. And I think that's it. It's like you create a safe kind of psychic space for yourself where like you're not in the world anymore, and there is a relationship between you and the book. And I mean, the best books I've read were ones where, like, I remember days as a kid just not moving. Like, I didn't want to have to step out of that world. And it's a rare book that makes me feel that way nowadays, where I'm like, not only do I not want it to end, but I don't want to leave the realm of, like, knowing those characters or knowing that place. Actually, that Gerard Conley book, Boy Erased, the memoir, was one of the few books that kind of happened for me recently. Because it was so much about the South, but also about the characters there, and yeah.
What is your relationship to physical books or to the act of reading? What kind of reader do you think you are? Or how are you a reader? Like, do you see yourself reading to escape, or reading for entertainment, or reading to learn how to do something?
I think I find myself reading to feel engaged. I definitely don't read for escape. I think I did a lot as a kid. Like, I loved to be in a world that was this other kind of bigger world. I think now, right now I'm really enjoying a lot of journalism. Like, when I was still living in the city, I just used to bring like Harper's and the New Yorker on the train, and I loved reading like all of the just profiles about people, and even like, I mean, I've always loved reading politics, but even some of the like economics type of stuff, like there's a part of my brain that's really getting into nonfiction actually, just because it is so different, and I feel like I don't have a TV, I haven't owned a TV in years, and I mean, I'm really deeply engaged with the news, but that's mostly through the internet, but there's something about being able to read a story about a person that feels really great. But I think for me, reading now, I'm always just looking for somebody that I can respect. I think that's the thing I would like look for in a voice, is just somebody, and it doesn't mean because they're super smart or because they're super one thing or the other. Like, I read Barry Hannah, and I just respect the shit out of him immediately. I don't know if it's because like of his pain. I don't know if it's because the stories are about the pain of the South, and like in a place where like segregation seemingly like is this ghost that's constantly haunting his stories, or if it's about like his failed marriages. But I think it goes back to that thing about like privacy. There's a sense of like him letting me into a part of himself that feels deeply generous, and that's what pulls me into reading. Like, I think I feel that way mostly about like James Baldwin also, where like Giovanni's Room, his novella, is probably in my top like 3 favorite books of all time. And I mean, I love his essays too, and he's so intellectual, and I love what he does with ideas. But that novel was so great because, like you were saying, it was all about identity, and like, but the identity of the book itself is so bizarre. Like, is it a murder mystery? Like, the way he sets it up in the beginning is that like it starts at the end where, you know, like something bad is going to happen to this guy. Like, the clock is ticking basically, you know, and then it goes back in time through him having like met his lover, and he leaves his like fiance to go to Paris and falls in love with this guy, and they have this like amazing, you know, romance. And but it's also an interesting book because Baldwin wrote the character as a white man also. So is it, and it's also a novella and not a novel. So like, is it a memoir? Is it fiction? Is it appropriation? You know, is it actually a murder mystery? Like, it's kind of a huge question. But I think it was a book that never worried about any of those things. He was just like, this is the book I want to write. I'm going to write that book, and it is amazing, you know.